Smoke clawed at the twilight, thick and black, devouring the horizon like an unstoppable plague. Flames twisted through acres of ripe farmland, crackling violently, silencing every hopeful whisper of life in their path. Another farm burning, another family's dreams reduced to ashes. It wasn't nature's fury storms didn't cut fences or pour gasoline. This fire had a human hand behind it, silent, calculating, merciless. Standing at the scorched edge of his land, a farmer's knuckles whitened as he clenched the foreclosure notice, grief and rage pulsing through his veins. This was no accident. This was war. And though he didn't yet know the face of the enemy surely knew him and was coming. James Townsend stood on the edge of a scorched cornfield, the blackened stalks crackling beneath his boots as he surveyed the damage. It was the third fire in as many months, each time creeping closer to his land in the rural heart of Oak Ridge County. At 42, James was no stranger to adversity. He'd grown up on this very farm, inherited it from his father, and had hoped to pass it on to his own son one day. But fate had intervened in the cruelest way possible. His wife Marjorie died 5 years ago, and the year after that, a faulty irrigation pump during a thunderstorm had claimed their only child, Daniel. Ever since, James had lived in silent mourning, plowing the same fields and repairing the same fences, his heart scarred by grief. Now a new threat loomed, an impending foreclosure brought on by successive bad harvests, mounting debts, and whispered rumors that someone, somewhere, wanted to buy up small farms for cheap. He lifted a singed cornstalk, rubbing the charred husk between calloused fingers. Though the sheriff called these fires accidents, James suspected otherwise. A few older farmers in the area had hinted that Agri-Systems, a large agricultural conglomerate, was silently circling, pushing vulnerable landowners to give up. Reports of intimidation, unusual storms of legal paperwork, and failing machinery had been cropping up for months. The farmland that once smelled of fresh earth and new beginnings now reeked of smoke, suspicion, and broken dreams. Exhausted, James trudged back across his property. The Townsend homestead lay at the center of 150 acres that once belonged to his father and grandfather before him. Where once stood golden rows of corn and well-fed cattle, now only weeds and leftover hopes dotted the dusty fields. Inside the house, the wallpaper peeled around old family photos. One captured James and Daniel fishing in the pond out back, both sporting the same crooked grin. He could hardly bear to look at it now. He headed out to check the far fence line, near the only patch of green still thriving, a small orchard of apple trees his mother had planted decades ago. On a typical day, his routine was to inspect the fence for any breaks, then examine the irrigation rig that had once short-circuited so disastrously. As he rounded the orchard, he stopped abruptly. A flash of gold and brown fur caught his eye, an injured dog, limping along, dragging what looked like a snapped leather leash. At first, James thought it might be a stray coyote or a half-wild mutt, but a closer look revealed a golden retriever with muddy fur clumped around its front paw, which bled onto the grass. The dog whined softly, its eyes full of pain and fatigue. James's initial instinct was caution. Rabies or aggression could be a risk, but the dog's tail gave a faint wag. Compassion outweighed fear. He approached slowly, extending a hand. "Easy there," he murmured. The dog licked his fingers, trusting. James scooped it up, feeling the trembling weight in his arms, and carried it toward the house. A fresh wave of sadness washed over him, thinking of Daniel's love for animals. Another memory, another piece of the past that still haunted every corner of this land. He had no idea that the arrival of this wounded creature would upend his world more than any fire a broken machine could. Once inside the small farmhouse kitchen, James gently placed the retriever onto a worn quilt folded by the sink. The quilt was old, hand-stitched by his grandmother, and still carried the faint scent of lavender. "Stay still," he whispered, though the dog clearly had no intention of going anywhere. Its muzzle rested on its uninjured paw, golden eyes following James's every move. Rummaging through a cabinet, James found an outdated first aid kit. Inside were bandages, a small bottle of antiseptic, and a pair of tweezers. With careful hands, he cleaned the laceration on the dog's paw. The retriever let out a brief yelp but never pulled away. Its collar was made of high-quality leather, dark brown with brass fittings, definitely not the kind you'd buy in the pet aisle of the local discount store. When James flipped the collar, he saw a nameplate Cooper. Next to it was a phone number, but no address. "Guess your name's Cooper," James said quietly. He reached for the old landline phone on the wall, only to remember, with a frustrated pang, that he'd had to disconnect it a year ago to cut costs. Cell service was spotty at best. He patted the dog's head. "We'll figure it out. Buddy, maybe I'll drive into town." After disinfecting and bandaging Cooper's paw, James offered him a small dish of leftover roast beef, what remained from last night's meager dinner. The dog wolfed it down, tail thumping weakly on the floor. James couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was the first hint of life and warmth he'd felt in this kitchen in a long time. While the dog ate, James leaned against the counter, mind churning with the day's grim discoveries. There was the scorched field, the looming bank notice pinned to the fridge, and now a lost dog of seemingly well-to-do origins. Could this be one more piece in the puzzle of strange happenings around Oak Ridge, or was it just coincidence? Shaking off paranoia, he tucked a few dollars into his wallet, just enough for Cone, and lifted Cooper gently. Outside, he eased the dog into the passenger seat of his battered pickup, ignoring the cracked windshield and the rusted door hinges. With a heavy turn of the ignition, the old engine sputtered to life. The plan was to drive to Woodbridge, the closest town with a functioning payphone at the gas station. On the way, he might stop by Olson's Hardware to pick up spare fence posts, if he had enough left over. As he steered down the gravel path, Cooper stuck his head out of the window, ears flapping in the breeze. For a moment, James was reminded of Daniel's wide grin the first time he'd allowed him to sit in the passenger seat, how carefree the boy had been. But that memory soon morphed into the tragedy that followed. It always did. Lost in thought, James nearly missed the turnoff for the gas station. Slowing the truck, he pulled into a cracked asphalt lot. The neon sign for Hutch's Fuel and Groceries flickered overhead. An older man named Clint Hutchinson ran the place, a lanky fellow with a white mustache who prided himself on being the local gossip. If anyone would know about the phone number on Cooper's collar or about the suspicious fires, it'd be Clint. "James Townsend," Clint drawled, swiping his grease-stained hands on a rag as James climbed out of the truck. Cooper hobbling at his side. "Haven't seen you in a while. You finally come to pay that tab for the brake fluid." James managed a small grin, though embarrassment flickered across his face. "Not quite, but I do need to use your phone. Found this dog wandering near my orchard. Hurt pretty bad." Clint whistled low and bent down to pat Cooper's head. "Fancy color on this one?" "Let me guess. New folks from out of county. We've had a few strangers pass by since that big farmland expo in the next state over. Could be related." James shrugged. "Could be. I just know he's lost. I'm hoping the owner picks up." Inside Hutch's cramped little store, the smell of old coffee and motor oil hung in the air. Rows of dusty canned goods lined the shelves, along with an odd assortment of automotive supplies. James headed straight to the payphone near the back. He fed it a few coins, then dialed the number from Cooper's collar. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. She sounded breathless, maybe worried. "Hello, who is this?" Hi," James began, glancing at Cooper, who sat patiently at his feet. "My name is James Townsend. I found a dog named Cooper, according to his collar." "I think Cooper," she exclaimed, relief flooding her voice. "Thank goodness. Is he all right?" "He's got a hurt paw, but I cleaned and bandaged it." "I'm in Woodbridge, near Oak Ridge County. You close by." A brief pause crackled on the line. "Yes, actually I am. I'll come right away. Where can I meet you?" James gave her directions to Hutch's. She promised to arrive within the hour. After hanging up, James returned the receiver to its cradle and looked down at Cooper. "She's on her way," he said, trying to sound encouraging for the dog's sake, though he wasn't sure why he felt compelled to reassure an animal. Clint leaned on the counter, curiosity in his eyes. "Any name?" Said her name was Holly, James replied, rifling through his wallet for enough cash to buy a coffee. Didn't catch a last name. Clint smirked, handing him a styrofoam cup. Least she's coming quick. Hardly anyone in these parts has the luxury of dropping everything to fetch a lost dog. She must not be strapped for time or money. James offered a non-committal shrug. He took Cooper outside to let the dog rest in the shade beneath a battered metal awning. 30 minutes ticked by, the sun beating down on them, until finally a silver SUV rattled into the parking lot. A woman hopped out, wearing jeans, a simple t-shirt, and hiking boots covered in dried mud. She rushed over the moment she saw Cooper, her face a mix of panic and profound relief. "Holly Westmont," she said quickly, kneeling to cradle Cooper's muzzle in her hands. The dog's tail wagged hard enough to shake his entire backside. Despite the bandage on his paw, Holly's auburn hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and James noticed she wasn't exactly the polished socialite Clint might have hinted at. There were smudges of dirt on her cheek and faint circles under her eyes. "I owe you a big thanks, Mr. Townsend," Holly continued, her voice trembling as she checked Cooper's paw. "He ran off during a storm last night. Thunder always scares him. I've been searching for hours." James shifted, not used to such direct gratitude. "I did what anyone would. He was hurt. You can call me James, by the way." Holly looked up, an honest warmth in her gaze. "Well, James, I'm grateful. Is there any way I can repay you? At least let me buy you lunch." Before he could answer, Clint, who'd been watching from behind the store's glass door, decided to insert himself. "Lunch, there's a diner a mile up the road. Holly, good pot roast on Thursdays." James's first instinct was to politely decline. He had fences to fix, equipment to maintain, and 1,000 anxieties swirling about the foreclosure. But something about Holly's earnestness and the comfort Cooper seemed to take in her presence nudged him to accept. "All right," he said, albeit quietly. "One lunch. Then I've got to head back." They arranged to meet at the diner. Holly coaxed Cooper into the back of her SUV, gently settling him on a soft blanket. She followed James's truck along the winding country road toward Louise's diner, a small establishment known mostly to locals. It looked like a relic from another era. A fluorescent sign flickered, half the letters missing, and inside was a row of vinyl booths. Louise herself greeted them, an older woman with a firm handshake and a sharper tongue. She led them to a booth by the window, her eyes darting from James to Holly in curiosity. "What brings you folks out this way?" she asked, wiping a table with a threadbare rag. James explained the dog situation, letting Holly chime in with details. Over steaming mugs of coffee, James caught hints about her background. She mentioned traveling a lot, living out of her car, and wanting to see how rural America really lived. He raised an eyebrow, quietly noting the contradiction. Her SUV was fairly new, the dog's collar expensive. She might be roughing it, but she clearly wasn't hurting for cash. Still, she spoke with genuine interest about his farm. When James reluctantly mentioned the fires and the rumor that agri-systems lurked behind them, Holly's eyes darkened, and she leaned forward. "Fires, they seem to happen near folks in debt." James nodded. "Some say it's all accidents, but I don't buy it. Too many times in too few weeks. My place hasn't gone up. Not yet, but the field next to mine got hit, and my farm is in trouble. Financially speaking." Holly grew pensive, as though taking mental notes. James couldn't help but wonder why she cared so much. Usually, outsiders brushed off local problems as not their business. But Holly asked more and more questions. Not in a nosy way, but in a manner that suggested genuine concern. The conversation felt oddly comfortable, making James forget, if only briefly, the weight of his responsibilities. They finished their meal, and Holly insisted on covering the bill. On the way to the parking lot, she glanced at James's old pickup. "I heard a weird noise when you pulled in," she said, a slight smile creeping over her lips. "Mind if I take a look under the hood?" James blinked, surprised. Sure," he replied. Popping the latch, Holly stepped around to the front, rummaging for a moment before using a flashlight app on her phone. She seemed confident, checking the belts, hoses, and connections like someone who'd done it countless times. Eventually, she straightened and wiped her hands on a rag. Your serpentine belt's about to give out, and your distributor cap is cracked. Not a big job, but it'll leave you stranded if you ignore it. James stared. Where'd you learn that? She gave a small shrug. My dad believed a person should know how to fix things, especially vehicles. Before James could probe further, the cook from the diner burst out the door, yelling for Louise. Hey, we got a grease fire in the back. Louise rushed inside, leaving James and Holly alone in the parking lot with the faint smell of smoke trailing from the kitchen vents. The irony wasn't lost on James. More smoke, more fires. But this was different, just a typical restaurant mishap. He closed the hood of his truck, then looked at Holly. You're welcome to visit my farm if you're really curious about what we do out here. The invitation surprised even him. He wasn't accustomed to letting strangers in. Her face lit up with an openness that made James feel oddly validated. I'd like that. Maybe I can help with any repairs you have been putting off. Sort of repay the favor for Cooper. He hesitated. I can't offer much in terms of comfort. The farmhouse is old. My landline is disconnected. And there's not much to do around Oak Ridge aside from farm work or reading the local paper. That's okay, Holly said, leading Cooper into her SUV. The dog settled down, tail still wagging, as though content with any plan that kept them together. I've been staying in campgrounds anyway. If you don't mind me pitching a tent somewhere on your property, I'll stay out of your hair. James thought about it. Part of him wanted to say no, he was dealing with enough trouble already. But he couldn't deny that her mechanical skills and genuine interest might prove helpful, and for reasons he couldn't name. Her presence soothed the silent ache in his chest. If only a bit. All right, he said at last. Follow me. I'll show you where you can set up. They drove in a small convoy through the back roads, dust trailing behind each vehicle. James glanced in his rearview mirror occasionally, noting how Holly kept pace effortlessly, as if she knew these winding roads by heart. It was getting late by the time they arrived, the farmhouse silhouetted against a pink and orange sky. Holly parked near an old barn that James barely used anymore, perfect for shielding a tent from wind and prying eyes. As he showed her the water spigot and warned her about the nighttime chill, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just pivoted. Fires, lost dogs, and a woman with the skill to fix his truck when these weren't ordinary coincidences. Something bigger was at play. That evening, James set a pot of coffee on the ancient stovetop in his kitchen. The overhead light flickered, a reminder that wiring updates were long overdue. Outside the window, he could see the faint glow of Holly's camping lantern near the barn. She was efficiently setting up a tent, unrolling a sleeping pad, and checking on Cooper's paw. The dog seemed comfortable, tail wagging as she spoke to him. James considered inviting her in, but a mix of habit and caution held him back. He wasn't used to company. He'd grown adept at solitude, wearing it like armor against new pain. Instead, he sipped his coffee alone, letting his gaze wander around the shadows of the house. Photographs of Marjorie and Daniel dotted a small mantel shelf above the fireplace. One photo in particular drew his eye. Daniel, 8 years old, beaming as he held a puppy in his arms. They'd only had the dog a few months before that irrigation pump incident short-circuited and changed James's life forever. He shook off the memory and stepped outside. The night air crisp. The porch creaked under his weight, and a single moth flitted around the lonely bulb overhead. He remembered the last conversation he'd had with Bill Clark, a farmer down the road. Bill had lost half his cattle to a mysterious illness shortly after he fell behind on loan payments to the same bank that now hounded James. Bill also reported men in suits coming around with generous offers to buy the land for far below market value. Agri-Systems. The name was whispered at feed stores, coffee shops, and hardware counters. A multinational agricultural giant with billions in capital and a thirst for expansion. James figured it was only a matter of time before he, too, faced a generous offer, especially if a convenient fire happened to ravage the rest of his struggling acres. Lost in thought, he didn't notice Holly approaching from the barn until she was almost at the porch steps. She cleared her throat softly. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. I wanted to make sure it was all right if I boiled water on my little propane stove. Don't want to burn your barn down." He gave a faint laugh. "It's not made of much worth saving. But sure, Osar. Go ahead. Just be careful." Holly lingered, glancing at the horizon. "Beautiful night," she remarked. The sky was a tapestry of stars, more visible here than in any city. James nodded, the weight of the day still on his shoulders. "I won't keep you." Holly continued, "But if you need any help early tomorrow, let me know. I'm an early riser." He was tempted to ask her a barrage of questions about her travels, her knowledge of mechanics, why she was so intrigued by Oak Ridge, but something in her posture suggested she wasn't ready to divulge everything. Instead, he just nodded. "I usually start at 6. If you're up, I could use a hand feeding the cattle and checking the fences." She offered a small smile. "Deal. Good night, James." As she walked away, he realized the strangest thing: her presence made this old farm feel less ghostly, rather than remembering only sadness. For a moment, he found himself planning tomorrow's tasks with someone else in mind. The notion was both comforting and unsettling. He finished his coffee in silence, letting the night's quiet wrap around him. Far off, a coyote howled, and James couldn't help but wonder if it was picking up the scent of new visitors. Tomorrow, he thought, would bring answers or at least more questions. At dawn, James found Holly already awake, folding her sleeping bag and carefully packing up her camping gear. Cooper sprawled on the grass beside her tent, his injured paw wrapped more securely now. When James approached, the dog scrambled up, wagging his tail so hard that his whole rear end wiggled. "You weren't kidding about rising early," Holly remarked with a grin. She slipped on a weathered baseball cap, stray wisps of auburn hair curling around her temples. "What's first on the agenda?" He led her to the small corral, where 5 cattle grazed around a half-collapsed trough. Their numbers had once been triple that, but times had been tough. Holly helped carry buckets of feed and fill water troughs, listening intently as James explained how each cow had a name or number, and how they'd recently struggled with a batch of tainted feed purchased cheaply from a supplier rumored to be in AgriSystem's pocket. "So they're hitting you from every angle," Holly said, pausing to wipe her brow. "Even the feed might not be safe." James sighed. "I can't prove it, but that feed was definitely off. 3 of my best cows got sick. Vet bills put me further behind on payments, and I'm sure the bank can't wait to see me fold." They spent the next hour mending a section of fence that had been snapped, likely in last week's storm. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the gentle breeze, although James noticed Holly sometimes hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal about herself. He picked up fragments she was traveling alone, had grown up in a smallish town, but left years ago, knew more about agriculture than the average passerby. Around mid-morning, they returned to the farmhouse for a breakfast of scrambled eggs, store-bought biscuits, and some bacon James had found in the freezer. The kitchen table was barely large enough for 2 plates, but Holly didn't seem to mind. With the morning task behind them, James decided to probe a little deeper. "You seem to know your way around more than just a camping stove," he said carefully, sipping coffee from an old ceramic mug that read, "World's Best Dad." "You mentioned your dad taught you about cars. Did he farm too?" Holly hesitated, fiddling with her fork. "Not exactly. He was an engineer, specialized in agriculture tech. But I've always been fascinated by farmland. My grandparents on my mother's side had a small orchard. Anyway, I guess the interest stuck." James didn't push further, sensing the topic was sensitive. Instead, he switched to his own troubles: the foreclosure letter he'd received 3 weeks ago, the fires nearby, and rumors about agri-systems. Holly listened, brow furrowed. She asked pointed questions. "When did you start missing payments? Has anyone approached you about selling? Who else around here is in the same boat?" "It's a pattern," she said at last, setting her fork down. "I've seen it happen elsewhere. Big conglomerates wait for small farms to default, or push them into default, and then buy everything up for pennies on the dollar. Their favorite tactic is to reduce a farm's productivity by messing with feed sources, machinery, or scaring off local businesses." James nodded. You seem well-versed in how they operate, more than an average traveler. A hint of tension crept into Holly's posture, but she forced a smile. Let's just say I've heard stories. She placed her napkin on the plate, the conversation drifting to a lull. Outside, Cooper barked at a field mouse skittering by. The morning sun poured through the kitchen window, casting both warmth and illuminating new questions that neither dared voice, at least not yet. Later that day, James and Holly tackled the orchard. It was the most fertile part of the property, where apple trees planted decades ago still bore fruit each fall. The orchard also held memories for James' picnics with Marjorie, teaching Daniel to climb the sturdy branches. Time and neglect had let the undergrowth creep in, and now the orchard looked wild, tangled with thorny brambles. They worked in companionable silence, pruning dead branches and clearing fallen limbs. Occasionally, Holly paused to ask about the significance of certain trees. James pointed out one called the keepsake, planted by his grandmother when she was newly married, or another named Autumn Crisp, grown from seeds Daniel himself had scattered one adventurous spring. As the afternoon wore on, they hauled debris into a pile for burning. The irony of piling wood for a controlled fire, while random blazes raged in neighboring farms, wasn't lost on them. James eyed the pile warily. We'll have to be real careful. One stray spark and we could lose everything. Holly agreed, rummaging in her backpack for a bottle of water. Speaking of losing everything, she said, voice quieter, I've noticed your irrigation system is practically rusted through. That must be expensive to replace. James let out a weary laugh. Try impossible on my budget. After my boy died, I blame that system. Partially. For the electrical short, I tried to upgrade, but the bank wouldn't extend my loan. Said it was unnecessary spending, so I patched it up as best I could. Holly frowned, as if troubled by this beyond casual sympathy. A better system might have saved his life. Yeah, James replied, throat tightening. It might have. A deep silence followed, broken only by Cooper sniffing around the orchard. James realized Holly was tearing up slightly, quickly brushing her cheek with the back of her hand. He wondered why his tragedy impacted her so deeply. Just then, the roar of a truck engine approached. Dust kicked up along the driveway as a green pickup pulled in. Out stepped Bill Clark, the farmer from down the road, his posture tense with worry. He spotted Holly and paused, clearly not expecting company. James, Bill said, doffing his sweat-stained cap. I just got word from Sam Kelly that his whole field of soybeans burned last night. It's real bad. They think maybe an accelerant was used. James swore under his breath. That's the fourth this month. Somebody's turning up the heat. Bill nodded grimly, then gave Holly a polite nod. Ma'am, didn't catch your name. Holly Westmont, she said softly. I'm just passing through. Bill didn't question further, focusing on James. You be careful. You hear word as the bank sent out letters to half a dozen folks near default. Fires keep happening to the ones who ignore those letters. His eyes flicked to Holly again, as if uncertain whether to say more with her present. Anyway, just wanted to warn you, and if you see anything strange, let me know. We got to look out for each other. James thanked him, and Bill climbed back into his truck, driving off in a cloud of tension. Holly exhaled slowly, picking at a loose thread on her shirt. It's not random, she said, not even trying to hide her anger. Someone's definitely behind this. Agri-systems, James said, almost certain, though he had no hard proof. But proving it's a whole different story. Nightfall brought a chill that seeped into James's bones. He rigged up a basic fire pit in the backyard, far from the barn and the orchard, carefully clearing a circle of dirt to reduce any risk. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the farmhouse's faded walls. He and Holly sat on a couple of old lawn chairs, Cooper dozing beside them, lulled by the crackling wood. The day's events weighed on them both. Bill's news about another devastating fire had only confirmed James's worst suspicions. Holly, for her part, seemed more introspective, occasionally sipping from a flask of tea she'd brewed. Finally, James decided to voice the question that had nagged him for days. You've been real helpful, he said quietly. You care about these fires and the plight of farmers more than most outsiders. You even know how to fix an ancient pickup. I keep asking myself why. Her gaze flicked to the ground, then up to meet his. I'll tell you part of it. When I was younger, my father worked with a major agricultural company, designing software to automate irrigation systems. At first, it was meant to help small farmers, but eventually the technology was sold to bigger players. Some folks lost their land because these companies found ways to manipulate data. My dad regretted it until the day he died. James stared into the fire, absorbing her words. So you're traveling around to fix what he couldn't, something like that. Holly hesitated, her jaw tightening as if there was more she wanted to say but couldn't find the words. She rubbed Cooper's ears, and the dog leaned against her leg, a comforting presence. Sometimes I just want to see for myself how this technology has impacted real people. And if I can help in small ways, I do. James nodded. He understood guilt and regret all too well. Well, it's appreciated. They fell into a companionable silence. The embers glowed between them, and for a moment James could almost imagine this was a normal evening, a neighborly chat, some jokes, the smell of burning wood. He let himself relax, recounting a childhood memory. My father used to hold bonfires this time of year. We'd invite the whole county. There'd be music, dancing, stew cooking on open flames. It was about community. You know, that's what's missing these days, Holly said, looking up at the blanket of stars. Community. Everyone's either scared or struggling to stay afloat. No one trusts each other. James took a deep breath. The swirl of smoke reminded him of the orchard fires. I don't know how to stop these fires or keep agri-systems from taking everything, but I'm not selling. No matter what. Holly placed a reassuring hand on his arm. You shouldn't have to. There's got to be a way. Just then, a shadow moved at the edge of the yard. Both of them snapped to alert, but it was only Bill's truck rumbling back. He pulled up and rolled down the window. Urgency etched on his face. James, he said, voice trembling, there's a rumor going around that your farm might be next. Folks saw two suspicious vans near the old railway tracks behind your property. Be careful. Before James could reply, Bill sped off, his headlights bouncing over the rutted road. Holly and James exchanged a look that carried equal parts determination and dread. Something was definitely coming, and they had no idea how soon it might strike. The next morning dawned with an eerie quiet. Even the roosters from the neighboring farm seemed subdued. James and Holly decided to check the perimeter, starting with the old railway tracks Bill mentioned. The tracks were overgrown with tall grass and weeds, seldom used. It was about a half-mile walk from the main field. Cooper trotted alongside, limping less than before. As they approached, James noticed tire marks pressed into the mud, two parallel lines, fresh enough that the morning dew had yet to erase them. These look new, he said, crouching to examine them more closely. Definitely bigger than your SUV. Holly, she nodded. Likely vans. Just like Bill said. She pulled out her phone, snapping a few photos. James frowned. You do that a lot. Document things. Holly offered a thin smile. Old habit. Might come in handy if we need proof. They followed the tracks until they disappeared into a stand of pines. Glancing around, James spotted some crumpled papers on the ground. He picked one up, a glossy brochure for AgriSystems Next-Gen Solutions. His gut churned. This was more evidence that the giant conglomerate had boots on the ground near his property. Holly folded the brochure, slipping it into her jacket pocket. Looks like they're scouting, she mused. Or maybe setting something up. The possibility of sabotage hung unspoken in the air. James swallowed, thinking of his battered irrigation system, the barn full of dry hay, the orchard that could go up in flames in minutes. This was personal now. On their way back to the farmhouse, they spotted Bill's truck in the distance. He seemed to be patrolling, eyes scanning the horizon. James appreciated the concern, but wondered how long it would be before Bill's own place got targeted again. As if reading his mind, Holly said softly, he can't watch your property forever. James exhaled. I know, but I don't want him risking his own farm just for me. They detoured to the orchard. Holly tested the soil near the roots, tapping on her phone. This orchard could be really productive if you had a proper drip irrigation system and maybe some updated fertilization methods. She said, I've studied orchard management just as a side interest. Her knowledge was staggering. She rattled off potential yields, ways to market direct to consumer, farm to table partnerships. James realized she wasn't some random traveler playing Good Samaritan. She was well informed, possibly more than some local agronomists. Who are you? Really, James finally asked, the question slipping out before he could measure his tone. Holly hesitated, biting her lip as if weighing whether to come clean. Before she could answer, they heard a noise, a distant pop like a muffled explosion. Instantly on alert, they jogged to the far side of the orchard, scanning the horizon. Mason, black smoke curled into the sky, maybe a mile away. Another fire, James said, heart sinking. That's close to the Watson place. They dashed back to the farmhouse. Holly quickly folded her tent and stowed her gear, while James tossed Cooper's supplies into the pickup. If the pattern held, this new fire might be the work of whoever left those tire tracks. If they were still out there, Barcer, it might be wise to keep all valuables and animals secure. Let's go check, Holly suggested. We might be able to help, or at least gather more evidence. They clambered into the pickup, fear gnawing at both of them. James took one last look at his farmhouse, the orchard, the decades-old memories embedded in every acre. He silently prayed it would still be standing when they returned. They barreled down the dusty road, tension mounting with each turn. In the distance, black pillars of smoke rose ominously above the treetops. As they neared the Watson farm, a small cluster of onlookers and volunteer firefighters came into view, dousing flames that threatened a storage shed full of hay bales. A swirl of ash and sparks drifted in the wind, making James's eyes sting. Holly jumped out first, Cooper bounding behind her, oblivious to the danger. She approached one of the firefighters, a local man named Gary Stanford. Need an extra hand, she yelled over the roar of flames. He handed her a spare extinguisher, and she immediately set to work, spraying down the edges of the fire. James tried to help an older farmer, Mr. Watson himself, pull a heavy tarp off a tractor in danger of being engulfed. Damn this heat, Sir Watson wheezed. James could see the fear in the man's eyes, the knowledge that losing even a single piece of equipment could mean bankruptcy. Within half an hour, the flames were mostly under control, though the shed was heavily damaged. Mr. Watson caught his breath, patting James on the shoulder in thanks. A deputy sheriff arrived on scene, scribbling notes on a pad. We'll investigate, the deputy said to Watson. But the words felt hollow. Everyone knew these investigations never led anywhere. After making sure there were no injuries, James and Holly regrouped near the Watson house. The older farmer offered them water, his voice trembling with anger. Whoever did this didn't just throw a match. They cut the lock on my gates, probably poured fuel inside. I found a jerry can out back. Holly glanced at James meaningfully. Same pattern, she murmured, remembering the brochures and tire tracks. Before they could say more, Bill Clark arrived, face pale with urgency. James, I drove by your place. Someone said they saw a white van heading up your driveway. Fear stabbed through James like a lightning bolt. Holly, we've got to go. They dashed to the pickup, Cooper leaping into the cab. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, and James floored the accelerator, gravel spraying beneath the tires. Holly clutched the dashboard as the truck lurched onto the main road. What if they're torching your fields right now, she asked, dread gripping her. James refused to speak, his mouth set in a grim line. The wheels tore over the rutted path leading back to the Townsend farm. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. When they rounded the final bend, the sight made Holly gasp. A white van, its doors flung open, sat near the orchard. Two figures dressed in dark clothing were sprinting across the field toward the tracks where another vehicle waited. James slammed the brakes, nearly skidding into a fence post. He killed the engine and jumped out, yelling at them to stop. Holly grabbed Cooper's leash, though the dog barked furiously, wanting to chase. But the figures vanished into the pines, gone before James could get within shouting distance. Heart pounding, he spun around, searching for signs of smoke. Relief flooded him when he saw none. The orchard and the farmhouse seemed intact. Then Holly hurried to the van, peeking inside. Empty, she said. But check this out. She pointed to a metal container reeking of gasoline, and next to it, a large stash of pamphlets, Agri-Systems Next-Gen Solutions. Some had been scattered on the van's floor. In the passenger seat, a worn notebook lay open, names and addresses scrawled across the pages. James saw his own name, circled in red, with the word irrigation scribbled next to it. James carefully lifted the notebook, his pulse hammering. Each page seemed to contain a list of local farmers, some with notes about vulnerabilities. Bill Clark was listed with a comment about livestock feed. Mr. Watson had hay shed, while James's own entry read, orchard plus old wiring. Chilling proof that these weren't random acts, but a coordinated attack on small farms. Holly cursed under her breath, rifling through the pamphlets. We have to show this to the sheriff, she said. This is the smoking gun. Whoever is behind Agri-Systems field operations is crossing legal lines: arson, property damage. James slammed the van's door shut, scanning the horizon for any sign of the fleeing culprits. They're long gone. He heard Cooper barking at the tree line, nose to the ground as if trying to track them. Still, they left behind their entire playbook. Probably panicked when we pulled up. They checked the orchard for any sign of sabotage, none. The gasoline container was unopened, meaning they likely hadn't gotten far in their plan. Relief intermingled with rage. They were about to burn my orchard, James said, voice shaking with anger and a tinge of heartbreak. They were going to take everything from me. Holly touched his arm gently, eyes full of sympathy and determination. We won't let that happen. Let's get this notebook to the authorities. Maybe this time they won't ignore the evidence. James nodded, but a nagging doubt lingered. Sheriff's investigations in Oak Ridge County had a habit of stalling, especially when big money was involved. Still, they loaded Cooper into the truck, stash of pamphlets and the notebook in hand, and headed straight to the sheriff's office in Woodbridge. Upon arrival, they were met by Deputy Rudman, a tired-looking man whose uniform seemed a size too large. Holly explained everything, from the suspicious van near the orchard to the near attempt at arson. She handed over the notebook and pamphlets. Deputy Rudman's eyes widened at the incriminating content. This is serious, he muttered, flipping through pages. I'll get Sheriff Larkin. You folks wait here. He led them to a cramped waiting area, the walls plastered with wanted posters and a faded map of Oak Ridge County. James paced, adrenaline still racing through him. Holly tried to calm Cooper, who whimpered, sensing the tension. After 10 minutes, Sheriff Larkin emerged, an older man with a thick mustache, accompanied by a younger officer. He solemnly greeted James and Holly, took the notebook, and asked them to recount their story. They did so in painstaking detail. When they finished, Larkin rubbed his temples. I've suspected something like this, but we never had solid proof. This could blow the lid wide open if these men are connected to Agri-Systems. Holly pressed him, so you'll launch a formal investigation. We can't let them keep terrorizing farms. Larkin nodded. We will. I'll call in the state troopers if I have to, but you two need to be careful. If Agri-Systems is truly behind this, they have resources and lawyers. They might try to bury this evidence or discredit you. James didn't care. He was past the point of intimidation. We'll do whatever it takes, he said firmly. There are families losing their livelihoods. It has to stop. Larkin thanked them and asked them to remain available for follow-up questions. As James and Holly left the station, a subtle fear gnawed at James. They had just kicked the hornet's nest. Would the sheriff actually be able to protect them, or was he in over his head? They drove back to the farm in silence, each lost in thought. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. Holly gripped the steering wheel. She was at the helm now, giving James a break. He stared out the window, watching farmland blur by, his mind churning with possibilities. Would the evidence lead to arrests, Or would agri-systems mobilize an army of attorneys to claim ignorance? When they arrived, James immediately noticed something off near the barn. A small silver sedan was parked beside his pickup. Confusion flickered across his face. Holly tensed, expecting company. "No," James said, stepping out warily. Cooper barked, his hackles raised. As they approached, a woman in a tailored suit emerged from around the corner of the barn, exuding an air of corporate professionalism that felt starkly out of place. Her hair was pinned back in a neat bun, and she carried a black binder. "Mr. Townsend?" she asked, scanning James up and down. "Yeah," he replied. Crossing his arms, she extended a business card. "Danielle Pratt, representing the Westmont Foundation. We're a philanthropic organization interested in sustaining small farms." James blinked, glancing at Holly, who wore a look of utter shock. "Westmont Foundation," he repeated, recalling the name from a magazine article about charitable grants for rural communities. "I don't remember applying for anything." Danielle offered a polished smile. "We heard about your situation and believe we can help. Our foundation has been evaluating at-risk farms that demonstrate potential for sustainable practices. Yours came highly recommended by an anonymous referral." Holly stared at the ground, her face unreadable. Then she cleared her throat and stepped forward. "And what exactly is the Westmont Foundation offering?" Danielle turned to Holly, blinking. "We provide grants, technical assistance, and sometimes legal aid if necessary, to help small operations transition to modernized, sustainable agriculture. We prefer to keep family farms going rather than seeing them swallowed up by larger corporations." Her eyes darted between Holly and James, picking up on the tension. "Perhaps I came at a bad time." James exhaled, the swirl of confusion threatening to overwhelm him. He recalled Holly's last name, Westmont. "Holly Westmont," he asked softly, turning to her. "Is this your foundation?" She looked away, guilt flickering in her eyes. "It was my father's originally. I expanded it after he passed. I've been traveling incognito, seeing how people actually live, not as some figurehead in a fancy office." Danielle, clearly uncomfortable, cleared her throat. "Miss Westmont, I was not aware you were personally on site." She extended the binder toward Holly. "The board has been trying to reach you regarding the new funding initiatives." Shock, hurt, and a surge of betrayal wrestled inside James. "So this entire time, you've been the founder of a major philanthropic group that helps farms like mine?" he asked, voice trembling with both anger and relief. "And you never mentioned it." Holly's cheeks reddened. "I didn't want you to think I was just some rich outsider throwing money around. I needed to see for myself." James stepped back, letting the revelation sink in. A part of him felt used, but another part realized that this was exactly the lifeline he needed. The Westmont Foundation could, in theory, pay off his debts, install new irrigation, and fight agri-systems in court. But at what cost to his pride, or to the trust they'd built? The next hours were a blur of tense discussions. Danielle walked James and Holly through a portfolio of what the foundation could offer: a large grant earmarked for upgrading the irrigation system, organic certification support, legal backing to deal with predatory lenders, and even investigative resources to counteract agri-system sabotage. On paper, it sounded like a miracle. James paced the living room, the old floorboards creaking beneath his boots. Holly waited by the doorway, arms folded, her expression torn between anxiety and hope. Danielle hovered near the kitchen table, binder splayed open. "With your permission, Mr. Townsend, I can begin paperwork immediately. We can have a legal team assess your foreclosure situation and stall it indefinitely if we find wrongdoing by the bank." His pride flared. "I'm not a charity case. I'm not looking for a handout." Danielle nodded politely. "Our grants aren't charity in the usual sense. We invest in the farm, you'd remain the owner. But the foundation sets certain sustainability goals and benchmarks. If you meet them, you never owe a cent. If you fail to meet them, we renegotiate. The point is to preserve and enhance small farms, not take them over." Holly stepped in gently. James, I know this is a shock. Believe me, I never wanted to mislead you. But I understand what you're facing. The Westmont Foundation could really help, if you'll let it. He paused at the mantel, fingers grazing a family photo of Daniel. So much of his life had been shaped by tragedy, regret, and constant worry. Now here was a chance to reclaim some dignity, rebuild the farm, and perhaps exact real justice on those who sought to destroy it. But it felt overwhelming, like he was trading one form of dependency for another. Looking Holly in the eye, he found something genuine, even amidst the secrets. He recalled how she'd jumped in to fight the Watson fire, how she'd saved Cooper's paw, how she'd learned local families' names and woes. "You really do care," he said, the statement sounding more like a question. She swallowed, stepping closer. "I do. This foundation was my father's passion. I inherited it, expanded it, and I guess I lost sight of who I was in the boardrooms and budgets. Traveling here, meeting real people like you, it reminded me why it matters, why small farms matter." Danielle, sensing the emotional undercurrent, excused herself to wait outside, giving them space. Holly let out a trembling breath once they were alone. "You have every right to be angry. If you want me gone, I'll go. The foundation can still help you, but you won't have to see me." James stared at the floor, then at the orchard through the window. His orchard. "If you're serious about saving places like mine," he said slowly, "then I want you to be part of it. But we do this together. None of those behind-my-back boardroom deals." She nodded, tears brimming at the corners of her eyes. "I promise. No more secrets." He extended his hand, and she took it, the warmth between them a fragile truce. Outside, Cooper barked as Danielle opened her car door. The future of the Townsend farm, and perhaps the fate of countless others, now hinged on forms, grants, and more importantly, a renewed sense of purpose. 6 months later, the Townsend farm was barely recognizable, except in the best possible way. Where broken fences and scorched fields once stood, new life flourished. The Westmont Foundation's grant had not only paid off the looming bank debt, but also funded a state-of-the-art drip irrigation system that drastically reduced water waste. Solar panels shimmered atop the barn roof, providing enough energy to power the farmhouse and the orchard's automated sensors. James walked through the orchard with a steady stride, accompanied by Holly, who now split her time between her corporate role in a newly reformed Westmont Foundation and her new home in Oak Ridge. Cooper bounded ahead of them, healthy and energetic, as if the fire-scorched fields and bandaged paw were distant memories. The orchard was in full bloom, delicate white blossoms promising a bumper crop come harvest season. County officials had opened an investigation into agri-systems, thanks largely to the incriminating notebook and testimony from farmers across the region. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of multiple farms, each alleging sabotage, predatory lending, or both. While the legal battle would likely take years, early signs suggested that justice might actually be served. Some regional banks even distanced themselves from agri-systems, sensing the tide of public opinion turning. Bill Clark's farm also received a smaller grant, allowing him to buy safer feed and upgrade old machinery. The Watsons rebuilt their hay shed with better fireproofing, and more families in Oak Ridge County began to speak up, sharing stories of intimidation and suspicious accidents. A renewed sense of unity rippled through the once isolated farmers, reminding them of a time when neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder. On that crisp spring morning, James and Holly convened a small gathering in the orchard, inviting Bill, Mr. Watson, and a handful of other locals to discuss cooperative selling strategies. In the last few months, they'd successfully tested direct-to-consumer markets, setting up a produce stand on weekends, even shipping organic apples to nearby cities at premium prices. James found himself reinvigorated. The financial gloom had lifted, replaced by the challenge of actual growth. After the meeting, James lingered by a particular apple tree planted years ago in Daniel's memory. Its blossoms were the whitest he'd ever seen, the branches sturdy and full of promise. He felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. "Holly, he'd be proud," she said softly, her eyes flicking toward the tree. James swallowed a surge of emotion. I hope so. I'm just glad his legacy is more than sorrow now. This place has a future. Holly nodded and her lips curved into a smile. So do we. She reached into the pocket of her light jacket, pulling out a small envelope. The board cleared a special fund for rural kids' scholarships in Daniel's name, if that's all right with you. His breath caught. That's thank you. In that moment, amid the gentle rustle of blossoming branches, James pulled a small velvet box from his own pocket. He'd never been one for big gestures, but life had taught him time was precious. I've seen enough secrets. And regrets, he said, voice trembling slightly. I want you here, Holly, not just as a partner into the foundation, but as family. Marry me. Her eyes brimmed with tears, the orchard's sunlight reflecting in them. The answer was obvious from the way she threw her arms around him. Cooper danced around their legs, barking in delight as though he understood the weight of the moment. The following weekend, they held a simple ceremony under that very apple tree, the petals drifting down like confetti. Neighbors came with covered dishes and heartfelt blessings, the atmosphere reminiscent of old-time community gatherings. There were no paparazzi, no corporate fanfare, just the farmland, the people it sustained, and a future bright with possibility. And so, the Townsend farm, once a symbol of tragedy and decline, became a beacon of hope. Fires, secrets, and heartbreak had threatened to tear it all down. Yet, with a lost dog and a determined traveler's quiet resolve, James Townsend found not only salvation for his land, but also a renewed purpose in life. In the end, the orchard stood as a living testament that from ashes, new growth can rise more resilient, more meaningful, and steeped in the promise of what comes next. As the last embers cooled on land that had seen tragedy and triumph alike, the quiet hum of renewal settled over the farm. It had been a journey of loss and redemption, of fire and faith restored. The fields once scorched by greed now blossomed with hope, yet every orchard tree bore scars beneath its bark, a testament to the cost of resilience. He'd found justice, yes, but the price had been steep, sleepless nights, painful memories, and confronting truths he'd rather have left buried. In the end, it wasn't the battles fought or the powerful enemy overcome that lingered most deeply. It was the quiet realization that home isn't just soil or buildings, but something intangible, forged by sacrifice, strengthened by community, and renewed by love. Life had taught him the hardest lesson of all. Nothing truly valuable comes easy, and no victory arrives without scars. He now stood rooted not just to this land, but to something greater, faith in the bonds that tie us together, in second chances earned through hardship. As twilight draped softly across the fields, one question lingered in the cool evening air. When you faced the flames and rebuilt from the ashes, what's the one thing you'd never let burn again?